Nepal, who is a member of the Prime Minister's Special Council on Rehabilitation and Reintegration of the Maoist Combatants in Nepal. And the talk of his that he's going to deliver this afternoon is titled Post-Conflict Rehabilitation and Reintegration of Maoist Combatants in Nepal. As most of us would realize, that a post-conflict situation is always far more complex than conflict itself. And it is even more complex in the case of Nepal because of the current political impasse that the country is going through. So we have seen various efforts in that country, but one of the success stories of the efforts in Nepal has been the post-conflict rehabilitation and reintegration of Maoist combatants. And there is nobody better qualified to brief us this afternoon than the Ambassador himself. So without further ado, Ambassador, the floor is yours, so that we have more time for question and answer after your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Major Munir. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here among such a distinguished group of friends, His Excellency Dr. Chaudhary, our ambassador here in Bangladesh, and of course all the friends present here. I don't know how many of you have noted that in fact last year the man that I worked for, the former Prime Minister and acting head of state, G.P. Koirala, received the highest honor from Bangladesh. And this year, three people with whom I know, I work very closely, former Foreign Minister Bastola, former Speaker Nagana, and a very good friend of mine, and Foreign Minister Casey. Three of them were given the Liberation Award of Bangladesh very recently. That speaks enough about the relationship that Nepal and Bangladesh have. And of course, in my own professional life, I have been highly impressed and observed and worked very closely and observed with great admiration the professionals of the like of His Excellency Dr. Chaudhary, yourself, General, and many other friends from Bangladesh. This relationship at the national level and this great admiration, professional admiration, has transformed into something more personal also, as my daughter is married to a Bangladeshi. So in fact, I have a very close relationship on all counts with Bangladesh. And so when I was coming here, and in our regular communication, I informed Major Munir, and he was very kind to organize this little sort of exchange of ideas on a topic that I thought would be of interest to all of us. Partly because being in the same region, very close neighbors, tremendous identity of views on almost all issues of regional and international affairs. It is also obvious for us that we exchange ideas, both good and bad, and we also exchange successes and failures. One of those issues that we ourselves experienced in Nepal was as you know, a tragedy of a kind that not only cost over 17,000 lives, over 100,000 internally displaced, over 2,000 disappeared, besides the tremendous loss of life and property, both public and private, in the form of the Maoist insurgency for almost a decade. So more than the physical and actual loss was a psychological impact on the nature of Nepali society. Because traditionally, Nepali society, as you know, was very well known for its culture of coexistence, despite a tremendous diversity of cultures, language, religion, and geography, of course. It was well known for its tradition of tolerance and cultural coexistence. And that psychological impact on society was, in my view, more than devastating, more than anything else. And so when this pain and suffering of the people got to a point, some people came up with what I would call almost an intellectual audacity, saying, what is this? Such extreme form of violence in the name of change, and counter-violence to resist it. Why is this causing so much suffering to a society? And so this intellectual audacity So this intellectual audacity was to question the rationale of the violence itself, both to those who were advocating it in the name of change and those who were using counter-violence on the part of the state to resist it. And the idea was that you create or strengthen what we call a democratic progressive political center, and thus isolating extremists on all fronts, whether of the right or of the left. This is what eventually became known as what we now know today called the Nepali peace process. This intellectual concept of strengthening the democratic progressive political center ultimately was taken up by the political leadership, which ultimately gave concrete form to what you know as the 12-point understanding between the Maoists who were engaged in this insurgency and the seven-party alliance of mainstream democratic progressive political forces who were fighting both the violence of the Maoists and the growing autocracy of the king. That 12-point understanding ultimately led to the famous April movement of 2006, which reversed the process, restoration of the parliament, which was dissolved by the king, subsequently the election of the Constituent Assembly to write a new constitution, and then after the Constituent Assembly, the declaration of Nepal as a republic by the first meeting of this year. That peace process took us to a point, but politics being as it is, the CA failed to agree on a constitution, and after repeated extension of its mandate and time. As you know, recently it was dissolved. Now, leading to what I have called an environment of political chaos and confusion. But part of that peace process exercise was an element wherein the comprehensive peace agreement agreed on what we call supervision, integration and rehabilitation of the Maoist army combatants. That task was entrusted to at the policy level, that task was entrusted to a special committee, by its name special committee under the leadership of the Prime Minister as coordinator. Now amidst all the disappointing political picture, I am happy to submit to you that I believe we have concluded that armed aspect of the exercise rather successfully. Because there were initially the Maoists had presented a list of about 32,000 of their combatants. The initial peace agreement conceptualized the what we call the SIR, the supervision, integration and rehabilitation of the combatants within the United Mission in Nepal, UNMIN. UNMIN was entrusted with that task. And in the initial phase, UNMIN did a good job to bring down the 32,000 original list of the Maoist demand to 19,602 combatants in 28 camps, 7 main camps and 21 satellite camps as verified Maoist combatants. Around 4,000 were verified as being disqualified, either in the form of minors, they were underage, or having joined the Maoist army after the comprehensive peace agreement was signed. So that problem was separated, and this special committee was given the mandate to resolve the question of this 19,602 Maoist army combatants. Initial task of UNMIN was to verify these and then resolve the combatants' problem. UNMIN was active in Nepal for almost 4 years. And of course, the comprehensive peace agreement itself envisaged the resolving the problem of the Maoist combatants within a very short time. And in retrospect, had that issue been resolved on time as envisaged, perhaps the political side of the picture would have been different today. I will come to that a bit later. But in any case, after waiting for 4 years, this special committee headed by the Prime Minister and its secretariat, of which I am a member, decided that the national institution, or in fact the state itself, had to take things under its own hand, that this was not going anywhere. So as a result, in January 2010, the Army mandate was terminated, and the special committee took over directly the so-called SIR exercise. Subsequently, we realized that one of the critical problems was again a conceptual dilemma. The conceptual dilemma was between, although there are a lot of literature available on the management of rebel army combatants globally in post-conflict situations, they were predominantly dominated by these global concepts of SSR and DDR. And And partly the reason why we believe UNMIN failed was it was not able to come up with the uniqueness of our own conflict and result to move beyond this established sort of notions. Because we eventually, after the special committee took over, we argued that neither SSR or DDR fully explained the nature of the work at hand. Because the debate there was those who were more sympathetic to the Maoists were very much focusing on the SSR, predominantly focusing on the reform of the army and its downsizing and downsizing, as opposed to those who were on the other side of the fence, so to speak, were emphasizing on DDR of the Maoist combatants. And so the debate did not take us anywhere. So the game changer really came from a concept that we introduced. And I have a piece that I published in Kathmandu Post, because after 4 years, this was enough. So May 18, 2010, I published a piece on the integration and rehabilitation, where I identified, first advocated moving beyond the SSR-DDR debate, and identified what I call 4 critical elements. That is, numbers. What number is the army prepared to, number of Maoist armed combatants is the army prepared to take? Or in fact, what is the possible number that the political leadership thinks it can integrate into the national army without changing the character of the national security force? So numbers were. The second one that we thought was important for the political leadership to decide was norms. Partly because the Maoists were insisting that their combatants had qualified themselves as they had created a state of no win, no lose with a much larger and bigger national army. So as a result, they didn't need to go through any other qualification to enter or to be integrated into the national army. Whereas the army itself, and by that time, it had, by 2010, the old situation where the army was basically identified with the king and the old establishment had moved away. And so the army had emerged much more stronger. And if you remember the case, how a Maoist prime minister had to resign because he wanted to interfere in a way with the succession in the armed forces. And all the other political forces said no. Because by then they had developed the strength to argue that no major national institution should be politicized. So as a result, they took a very strong position in this case. So in any case, the army took the position that they would preferably not take any combatants at all, quite natural in their thinking. But if the political leadership was to make a decision, then they would take as minimum as possible. And that also in terms of after qualification of their standard criteria for entrance into the army. So that was the issue. So norms was the second. The third issue was modality that we identified. What was the modality to be adopted? Because the Maoists wanted what they called a group entry. That in fact 2 or 3 brigades had to be in the army. Whereas the others said, no, that cannot happen. There is no such thing as group entry. That if anyone was to be integrated into the army, had to go through a individual qualification process. And only on that basis would they be integrated. So the third issue was modality. And fourth was, of course, as all of you know, in any post-conflict integration process, question of ranks. What is the maximum rank that either the state at a given time, or in fact the establishment as the army is prepared to concede, or in fact give to the rebel combatants? So these four were identified as the critical issues on which the political leadership needed to decide if they wanted this process, the so-called supervision, integration, rehabilitation process, to move forward. And that is when I think the name of the game changed. Otherwise, before that, all of the discourse that was taking place around this subject was either SSR or DDR, or within which model would we resolve this problem. Soon after that, things moved a little bit. The Maoists eventually decided to concede, at least in name, the cantonments to the state. Of course, the situation there in terms of why this was important was because the process applied in terms of the storing of the weapons was what we call a single lock. All the Maoists, the weapons collected from the Maoists were stored in locked containers in the seven main camps. But the keys were still with the Maoist commander. So, first point was there was an increasing demand that if the Maoists were to be accepted as a mainstream political party, and by then, as you know, during the CA election, they had emerged as the largest party, and in fact, their chief had already become prime minister. So there was a nominal handover of the camps, but still the actual supervision still remained with them. Gradually, that process changed as the pressure that this exercise was taking too long moved. We then conducted what we call a re-verification exercise, because initially it was 19,602 that was given by the UN mission. When the special committee conducted this re-verification exercise, then there were only approximately 17,052 combatants in the camps. So in other words, almost 2,500 had either left or in fact were not there. So that was the second major move forward. But at the political level, the real movement only came after June, July of 2012. Because when it started to be clear that the political process was heading to a deadlock, that the Constituent Assembly was unable to fulfill its mandate after repeated renewals. And in fact, if the issue of the Maoist army combatants was not to be resolved on time, that in fact there was the risk of the conflict re-emerging then. Because the weapons were still in the containers, the keys were with the Maoist commanders, and the army, on the other hand, was getting very, very impatient. So as a result, in the special committee, we took this very seriously, and then we decided that things had to move forward. And what we did was we came up with a package. The political leadership then eventually decided that in terms of numbers, the government would agree to a maximum of 6,500 combatants to be integrated into the army. That was the decision on the numbers. On the norms, it was agreed that all other criteria for entrance into the army would have to be fulfilled by the combatants concerned. but they will be given exception in 3 areas. One, of course, the army regulations said that no married person could enter the army. But since they had been there for a long time, so that criteria of marriage was waived. The second was there were specific educational qualification required right from recruit to officer level. So there was a decision to give concession of 1 grade. So in other words, if somebody had left past 8th grade, then in fact they would be regarded as having passed 10th grade. So they would qualify